speculative naturalistic ethics. We've looked at hedonism, we've looked at asceticism, logical positivism, pragmatism. So this morning we come to a fifth naturalistic, speculative, philosophical system of beliefs and practices. And it's going to take us a considerable amount of time, longer than what we've spent on any of the other ones thus far, to cover this, because the whole world is controlled by the greed for power. So this morning we start looking at the ethics of power. It particularly has reference to political situations or any place where you have leadership or government involved, but it most definitely applies down to the personal, individual level. Every person in the world is out for power. No one likes being powerless in life. Whether it's just enough power over your employer at work, so you go on strike and rant and rage, a small matter there, or power over something larger than that. Everybody's concerned about a greed for power. How can you really advance in life if you aren't power-minded? If you have the weak mind that, according to some of these founding fathers of the ethics of power, said that Christianity produced in people, then how can you expect to get ahead in life? The meek person simply doesn't get ahead in life. He can't get ahead. He's always putting others before himself. The one way to get ahead in life, as well as have all of your needs and desires satisfied, is to follow the philosophical train of thought of the greed for power. You have to have power in order to have things produced in your life. Power by means of energy is what produces things. You don't just have electricity come on all of a sudden without a power source somewhere. The old locomotives didn't just start up and take off running on four legs down the track. They had coal, they had wood bins that generated power by means of heat. You had to have some source of power. In other words, power is what makes everything go. Without power, you go nowhere. You're only run over by those around you who are all heading towards the one goal of the greed for power. So there's an innumerable list of advocates under this system of ethics, people who've taught or practiced some form of natural authoritarianism. And we're only going to look at 4 of the greatest names, or really 5. We're going to start back in the BC years with one Greek writer by the name of Thrasymachus, who, for the first time in the systems of beliefs in the world, which hadn't been going on very long. Remember, we're only going back to maybe the 5th century BC in Greece for the foundation times for the systems of ethics and for the systems of philosophy. There have always been hedonistic people, there have always been ascetic people, but they haven't had these formalized systems until the 5th century BC. So Thrasymachus, who lived just a little bit before Christ, a Greek writer, taught that leaders should be like shepherds. Well, that's not bad. The Bible compares the leaders in the church to shepherds, because God himself in the 23rd Psalm is compared to a shepherd. But that's not all that Thrasymachus had to say. He said that leaders should be like shepherds who fatten their own sheep to slaughter and eat them. What shepherd wouldn't, as Paul even teaches over in 1 Corinthians 9, not be a partaker, first of all, of his own produce? Certainly that's what shepherds do. I admit it's kind of, well, it's not cruel, but the people concerned about the animals would say, have a heart concerning them. How could you raise an animal from an infant stage right out in the backyard and then slaughter the thing and have it on your table? Some people can't put up with that. My mother had a problem with that. They raised chickens, and she just couldn't watch their necks wrung whenever the chickens had run around and played so happily out in the backyard for so long, and you went out and wrung their neck and put them on the table. So you pretty much have to pass over thoughts like that when you're trying to enjoy nice piece of beef or poultry or something like that, because you see a beautiful little animal running around. But for Thrasymachus, the animals were the people. And the one reason that you governed over people was so that you could take advantage of them. If you were in a position of leadership, the reason that you were there and the way that you got there is that you took advantage of people who were either in your way or who were under you. So the point is, fatten your own sheep so you can slaughter them and kill them. Now this is not anything new. If you go back to Genesis chapter 10, it started at least as early as old rebellious Nimrod. In Genesis 10, verses 8 and 9. It's not worked into a formalized system where we have records of it today. We've got the remains of some ancient temple towers in Babylon known as ziggurats today, but that's about all of the remains that we have in an observable form. Genesis 10, verses 8 and 9. Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. All of these designations concerning Nimrod all have a negative connotation. If you haven't studied the passage, you won't recognize that. You would think just the reverse is true, that Nimrod is being praised for his mighty exploits here. But it's just the opposite connotation being gotten across concerning Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one. We're talking about the greed for power. And he was a mighty hunter in opposition to the Lord. A mighty hunter. Mighty hunter of what? Did he go out and hunt geese with bow and arrow over Tigris, Euphrates marshes? No. We've shown you before he was the hunter of the souls of men, which we find over in Revelation 17 and 18, that this is what great Babylon is all about, is she is a hunter of the souls of men. Wherefore it is said, as a matter of fact, Nimrod was so proficient in what he did, it became a modern proverb of his day. When anyone else did the same thing that Nimrod was doing, then the proverb was, this man is doing even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter in opposition to the Lord. You go on into chapter 11, the first 9 verses, and we find out, no doubt, Nimrod is the instigator behind this movement of the descendants of Noah and his 3 sons to defy the commandment of God when he told them to fill up the earth. In other words, to spread out, don't concentrate yourself in one place. When he gathers the people together to build a city and to build a tower whose top is heaven. We have the beginning of astrological worship and so forth. But the point is, Nimrod is having to corral a whole large number of men. You can't be a king and you can't have a kingdom until you have subjects to make up your kingdom and subjects over whom you may rule. How in the world could you be a shepherd without sheep? You have to have sheep in order to be a shepherd. The only way that you can have power is to have people that you have power over. Power is not just some abstraction. Power is something that's exercised on other people. We're talking about in the personal or in the political realm. So Nimrod, we could say, is really the founding father, not only of false forms of religious worship, which we see in chapter 11 and verse 4, but he's the founding father of the ethics of power, not as a system, but as a practice in his life, where he was a mighty hunter. He hunted after the souls of men. Look in Roman Catholicism today. She's governed by the greed for power, the greed for moving up the rank of the ecclesiastical hierarchy and ruling over untold millions of the souls of men. She has in bondage, as well as the whole denominational system, untold millions of the souls of men, following in the steps of their founding father, Nimrod. So we could say that Nimrod's the founding father of the ethics of power. Thrasymachus puts it into writing as a system of beliefs. But then neither one of these are as important for this morning's study as the following 4 men that we're going to start looking at, beginning with Niccolo Machiavelli. We want to briefly study the ethics of power as a system of organized belief. And I think you'll find it very interesting in light of the very way that nations are governed today. Now we recognize Romans 13:1, that we have to submit ourselves to the powers that be, because there is no power that hasn't come from God. But we also have to recognize Daniel 10, Luke chapter 4, 1 John chapter 5, that in an immediate sense, it's the powers of darkness who are the control behind the kingdoms of this world. We have human government established in Genesis chapter 9. Human government has to exist, or you have total chaos in the world. You have to have leaders over people underneath them, and you have to have laws made by these leaders, or every man does that which is right in his own eyes. We have no problem with the fact that human government has been established, but we know, because it's under the immediate control and direction of Satan, the prince of the power of the air, the prince of the kingdoms of this world, that it's filled with corruption, it's filled with dishonesty, it's filled with this greed and lust for power, the very thing that we're talking about. That's the way you work up in the denominational system, is you have a greed for power. You have to make the right contacts with the right people. To go from your 50-member Baptist country church to that big downtown First Dead Baptist church with maybe 5,000 or 10,000 members. You have to have a greed for power before you get to a place like that. The same is true in politics. No one just all of a sudden goes up in politics. Even if you're born into a Kennedy Rockefeller family, you've still got to get in there and start working and start pulling some strings and start running over some people. There is no such thing as an honest, good-hearted, loving politician. Amen. They do not make good bedfellows. They simply can't exist together. You cannot be honest, good-hearted, good-natured, a family man, a loving, tender, kind, forgiving, compassionate, considerate individual, and be a politician. It's impossible. Utterly impossible. You have to run over people to get to the place where you want to go. Now, all of this is forbidden in Scripture for the people of God. Whether it's in so-called ecclesiastical hierarchy or whether it's in the political hierarchy out there. There is a way to go up, and it's not by means of the greed for power and of the greed for the control over the souls of other men. So, Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469, 1527. Again, we're talking about some of the most famous men who have ever lived, or infamous if you're studying them from a Christian perspective. From the world's perspective, we're talking about some of the most famous men who have ever lived. I don't know if you're familiar with Machiavelli, or at least his name, or at least some of his beliefs or his position. But if you're not, you'll probably be familiar with some of the other ones that we'll get to later on. He was an Italian statesman and philosopher who was born May 3rd, 1469, died June the 21st, 1527, who wrote one of the world's most famous political books, one of the world's most famous political science books, known as The Prince. Have you ever heard of that before? In 1513. In which he revised the teaching of Thrasymachus, the early Greek writer who came just a short time before Christ, because we've got a 1,500-year period of silence concerning political science between the time of Thrasymachus and Machiavelli, due to the influence, the silent influence of Christianity. It's kind of like the effects that Christianity had on hedonism. Remember when we studied hedonism, we said that the original form of hedonism, for the most part, was a selfish form. It was pleasure for the individual. Whether for a moment or for a lifetime, it was still pleasure for the individual. Yet Christianity intervened between the original forms of hedonism and what we saw brought about by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century, because Christianity brought these thoughts and these concepts of doing good unto others rather than doing good unto yourself. And so men still want to have pleasure, they still want to have fun in life, but how in the world can you justify, in light of the effect that Christianity has had on the world, egoistical hedonism? There's no way you can justify it. So Bentham, we said, in hedonism came along and invented this universalistic hedonism, the same thing as utilitarianism, where whatever does the most good and brings the greatest happiness to the largest number of people is right in society. What made hedonism change from that original form to the modern revival? The influence of Christianity. The same thing is true with the greed and the ethics of power. Between Thrasymachus and Machiavelli, we've got the intervention of the loving, peaceful religion known as Christianity. So he's going to revise some of the teachings of Thrasymachus. But the important difference between the revision of the power ethics as opposed to the pleasure ethics is that Machiavelli doesn't make it any better, like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham tried to do with regard to hedonism by expanding the boundaries of it to include more people besides just self. He said that the best government is a government of absolutism. Well, that's the same thing Thrasymachus said, that a shepherd should be one who would fatten his sheep so that he can kill them and put them on his own table. Not a literal sheep, but your people. You exploit your people. You get your people to follow you, and then you exploit them. And you'll just see how this touches home just about everywhere, even in a so-called democracy like the United States. Machiavelli said, by the way, he was totally anti-democratic way of life and principle, that a democracy couldn't exist or shouldn't exist because it spreads the power to too many people. And a true democracy would do just that, a true democracy. But if you study political science, you'll find out there has never existed. This is a surprise to people brought up in this country. It's a fact of political science that there has never existed and that there never will exist a democracy. The very word shows it's an impossible entity. It's impossible. We're not a democracy. This country's a republic anyway. It's founded on the precepts of Rome. We got all of our laws and thoughts about how to govern our people and how to set things up in the court systems, right from the Roman what? Democracy? No, Rome was a great republic, from the Roman Republic. So he's right on a democracy, assuming that such thing as a democracy could even exist, which of course I'm saying that it couldn't. He said that it spreads the power to too many people. What happens when you take some object, peanut butter jelly, you spread it? You get too little in too many places rather than concentrating it all in one area. You dilute your power then. You dilute your power whenever you spread it out. He's exactly right. An autocracy, he said, is not any better. You don't have as many leaders in an autocracy as you do in a democracy, but the few leaders that you do have in an autocracy are just a few too many. Any more than one, and of course the one has to have understudies that do his bidding for him, but any more than one absolute leader is too many. That's why his system of belief was a belief of absolutism. So in other words, he taught that a political expediency should be placed above morality. Political expediency, the doctrine of what helps and what we need right now. What's expedient? What's necessary now? Should we consider the long-range consequences? No. Should the American public consider the long-range consequences of the 1.5 million person per year murdering of the country's most precious national resource, her people? Should she consider the long-range consequences? No. Since the early 1970s, 15 million people, not in battle. We didn't even lose that many people in a lot of the wars we fought. Amen. 15 million people have been lost in a losing cause in the battle against abortion. Should we consider the long-range consequences, the traumatic experience, the insane asylums? You just have to do a little study, and this is just the facts of experience that are being populated by young women who have murdered their own children, who have thought about it later on in life, or who have thought about it not so later on in life. It doesn't take very long to think about something like that, that you took your own child's life. And some of them, because they either didn't have the money or couldn't get to one of these free places, waited until they came out of the womb and then strangled them, their own children. That's going to have terrible, terrible psychological consequences in your life starting right then. They end up addicts, they end up on alcohol, they end up divorced and remarried dozens of times. And too many of them, sooner or later, end up in the asylums because they can't control the thoughts of their mind now. They've got murder on their conscience in the past. But why did they do it? It was expedient. What will my parents think? I'm not married. We don't have the resources. We didn't want the thing anyway. So it's expediency. There it's not political, there it's personal expediency. But again, the individual liked to exercise his free use of power. But yet he found out that power, the exercise of the free use of power, especially in the abusive realm, always has consequences to it. I mean, we can look at the world's greatest leaders of absolutism, Hitler himself. He didn't last very long. You're going on a rampage for the greed for power, always going to have serious consequences. Hitler ended up having to take his own life because he didn't want someone else to get to him. No one has lived forever who had a greed for power. It's just that because of the doctrine of expediency, people's vision is nearsighted. They can't see this is not going to do what I want it to do anyway. Christianity is the only answer to all of life's problems. Amen. It is the only answer. Amen. Because everything else ends either with the failure of your program or, secondly, with your death. Everything ends either when your program fails or whenever you fail and you die. And yet Christianity doesn't fail when you fail. The righteous man might stumble 7 times, but God will still lift him up. Amen. And neither does it fail whenever you die, because to die and to depart is to be with Christ, which is far better. There is no better. We're talking not about just quoting a lot of Bible verses. We're talking about looking at it from a rationalistic standpoint. There is no rational option to life besides the message of Jesus Christ. Hallelujah. There's no rational option. Any person who chooses another option has chosen so irrationally. Irrationally. Because all of the world, all of the systems of this world are irrational in nature. They don't make any sense. Right. They don't work. This country and the people in this country and the leaders of this country, for some reason, think that we're going to last forever and ever. That's right. That's right. And yet the facts of history show us no one has lasted forever and ever. Every kingdom comes to an end sooner or later. Great Rome lasted for almost a millennium. But we're talking about it past tense, aren't we? It's been gone for 2,000 years now. Great Rome, the greatest nation that had ever existed, and lasted for almost a millennium. And we've been on the scene for 200 years. And yet you know that's the average concept. You know that was your average concept before becoming a Christian, that America's America. You don't even think in future tense. Right. This country, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, it's not even going to be here. This may all be flooded, bombed out. Maybe the Indians will have their rightful land again. It belonged to them anyway. Maybe the Soviets will live here. Maybe we'll be all in concentration camps over in the depths of Siberia somewhere. No one even thinks of thoughts like that. Man just goes along merrily in life, concerned just about the now. The greed for power and money and lust and prestige. Right now, what can I have now? Not thinking about the consequences. Oh, reading a book like Ecclesiastes does one a lot of good. Because there are other things besides just today. You can sin, and it may not affect you today. You may not be judged today. But just because there's a delay in the judgment of God doesn't mean that it's completely been thwarted. That judgment is going to come. Just because, as a Christian, someone has chosen to partake in the lust of the flesh and indulge in sin, just because a Christian has chosen to do that, and he hasn't been chastised yet, doesn't mean that he's not going to be. Oh, chastisement may be 5 years later. It may be 10 years later. But it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And he doesn't forget the charges against him. He doesn't forget them. They will surface again sooner or later. So Machiavelli said that the human political leader should be like a fox. A political leader should be a human fox incarnate, in other words. You know what a fox does. Oh, is he sly? He said the human leader should keep the faith whenever it's in his good interest and break it whenever new situations arise. Depending on what the situations are, you're governed again by the doctrine of expediency. Not looking at the right and wrong of what's been done and not looking at the consequences of what's been done, but what needs to be done in order to get over this bump in our government's existence or in my personal existence right now. What needs to be done? And you can never be governed by the doctrine of expediency. You have to be governed by the Word of God. Because when you're in a tight situation, you'll compromise the Word to get out of the situation, obviously. You are put in a tight situation at work, and so you tell a lie instead of tell the truth. Why? Because of what it'll produce? No, it'll help you right now. Again, that's the here and the now, and again, that's expediency. And again, all the governments of this world are controlled by that. It doesn't matter how Christian some of them may sound, they still will always substitute political expediency in the place of recognized morality. Now, we've got a professedly Christian government, and just to show you the evils of our own government, do they avoid this doctrine of Antichrist and of the systems of this world? Well, certainly not. We would all, myself included, we would all be shocked and surprised if we knew firsthand all of the depths and the details of the subterfuge of this government. We're talking about one who pledges allegiance to a flag and prays to God whenever they meet on the Senate floor. And yet we would be shocked. You go back and study a little bit of the history of Vietnam, where the whole country was lied to by the establishment in Washington. They gave the lies to the news media, and the news media didn't know any better, not at that time. She found out later on. You got these snoopy reporters, and that, by the way, is when American media changed with Vietnam and Watergate, because the American people, as well as the media, got tired of the establishment in Washington lying to her all the time, telling us all of these things that were going on over in Vietnam and how we were really pushing back the enemy. You only have to be about 25 or older to know some things about the Vietnam War. That continually these reports, there's a trial going on right now that you'll have to just wait and find out the outcome of with CBS and General Westmoreland, who was the commander-in-chief from 1964 to 1968 there, to find out what really was going on over there. I just finished reading, or not recently, it was several weeks, several months ago, I guess now, Stanley Carno's History of the Vietnam War, a 700-page political science scholarly treatise on the subject, and it's fascinating. The details of what now are really just part of the public domain of knowledge that went on over in Vietnam that the American public was lied to about. Why doctrine of expediency? Because if we tell them the truth, if we tell them that it's costing us $10 for every $1 of damage that we do over there, then they're going to try to burn down the White House in. If we tell them that the all-important kill rate is less than 1 man per day, what are they going to do to us then? Can you imagine spending a whole decade and the kill rate in Vietnam was 0.95 men per day? You kill less than, what war is about is getting rid of your enemy. You can't just drop bombs indiscriminately in the midst of the dense forest and jungle and think that's going to do any good, but kill a few iguana lizards there or something. That's not going to do any good. What you have to do is destroy the people so that whenever you leave, they won't rise up and do just what they did before you came over there to begin with. Amen. What have we pulled out of there? They came out of the holes. They'd been hiding everywhere. Amen. Less than 1 man per day for a whole decade over there. We dropped triple the tonnage of bombs on Vietnam in a 10-year period than on all of Europe, Asia, and Africa during all of World War II. But during World War II, we were successful because we just about bombed the cities of Germany right off the map. And yet you study Vietnam, was Hanoi ever seriously bombed? No, not a bomb on the city. What about the dikes of the Great Red River? If they had just been bombed, the rice fields would have been flooded, killing hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese as well as the Viet Cong guerrilla soldiers. Was that ever done? No. Where were the bombs dropped? In the middle of nowhere. And yet that was the greatest boast of the administration under Johnson and Nixon is, and I can't use the language that they use that's been recorded, that we'll bomb those such and such is right off the map. But you're not hitting anybody when you bomb in the middle of a jungle where nobody is. And if someone's there, it's a band of 50 Viet Cong guerrillas or a band of 75 national North Vietnamese soldiers, that you're not going to find them anyway.
For the continuation of this message,
when you bomb in the middle of a jungle where nobody is. And if someone's there, it's a band of 50 Viet Cong guerrillas or a band of 75 national North Vietnamese soldiers, that you're not going to find them anyway. And here we spent all of the money, all of the time, all of the lives, sending 18, 19, 20-year-old boys to fight a man's war who didn't want to be over there, whose whole life was spent day after day after day plodding through flooded rice fields in almost unbearable heat, never finding that elusive Viet Cong North Vietnamese soldier because we're fighting on his home territory. Never knowing on what rice dike or on what little patch of grass to set your foot next for fear of this elaborate system of booby traps they had invented. And it produced terrible psychological consequences in these soldiers after they returned home, because they watched their buddies being blown to bits in front of them and heard about it behind them, and the mental strain drove many of them totally insane on knowing, where should I put my foot next? Where should I go between these two trees? The jungle is so dense you never know where there's one of those little string set that you trip it and rockets go off and grenades go off, and not even the modern inventions. They went back to the old Stone Age inventions of digging a pit, putting sharp spikes at the bottom, covering it up. We lost many soldiers who fell through things like that. And the average day of the average GI in Vietnam was spent doing just that, looking for an elusive enemy that he couldn't find, and doing it in unbearable heat, doing it with a lot of provisions. The whole time they were in Vietnam, the average GI had 100 pounds of supplies per man per day. Cigarettes, more cigarettes and drugs and whiskey than you could find in your average store on a corner right here in America. And that's why they weren't so good once they got over there. There was nothing to do but sit around and get high and drink and smoke and then wander around for a few days looking for some people that you couldn't even find. What are we talking about? A government, the United States government, the Christian U.S. of A., who deceived the American people all in the name of this greed for power, and sent these young men over there who accomplished nothing, who came home shamed by this country, and during the whole episode told us a lot of lies. It's just about unbelievable, except we all lived through it. We know that it really did happen. It's just come out recently that as recent as last spring, this Christian United States of America had full-scale plans already drawn up, already tested for an invasion of Nicaragua. And they were stopped whenever they got there because the CIA had already snuck down there and mined the harbors of Managua. What's the CIA doing down there? What's the United States government? And did the American public know anything about it then? No. We didn't find out about that until just the past few weeks now, that it's finally come out by people who've gotten out of the CIA. Oh, the FBI is one thing. Nobody's concerned about the FBI. The CIA, it's the United States' #1 hit team. Regardless of what, you see, you can either believe what I'm telling you or what the government tells you. The government will say, oh, no, we don't run around assassinating people. Oh, yes, this government does. Oh, yes, the CIA does. Just ask some of the people who've gotten out of the CIA and broken their vow of never speaking about political matters again. Whenever you get out of the CIA or the FBI or any of these high positions, you have a vow that you can never, ever speak about these subjects as long as you live until the day you die. It'll be too late to speak about them after then. It's impossible. You're gone. And yet some of them speak about it anyway because of the atrocities that go on behind closed doors that the American people never know about. Well, our point is democracies aren't exempt from ethics of power. Just because you say that you are a democracy and you say that you have spread your power out among various bureaucrats through national and state levels doesn't mean that there's still not certain groups of people, and one group is the infamous CIA, who has almost absolute power to do whatever they want to do.
Right.
It surfaced here in the election about a hit manual that was done by the CIA. Oh, and our political leader said, oh, no, that was, someone somewhere. No, don't believe all of that stuff. They are lies. The American public really hasn't. The news media has learned. Learn from Watergate, learn from Vietnam, that the government's not going to tell you the truth. No, not a Christian government is not going to tell you the truth. And yet we've got untold numbers of Christians supporting this government. Oh, they're just so thankful. They're on their knees every day thanking God for tongue-talking leaders in the White House. And they're talking many languages, all right. Now, I don't mean speaking in tongues. They're talking the languages of deception. They're telling you something out of one side of their mouth, but behind closed doors, they're talking about the reality of existence in the world out of the other side of their mouth. Yeah. We were going to invade Nicaragua just this past spring. Did any of us know anything about that? No. The government never let it out, which is a miracle that the old news media didn't get a hold of it. The news media is like the best snooping bloodhound a person could have. They can find just about everything. The news media, like one man recently characterized them, can be compared to three blind men who are looking in a dark basement at midnight for a black cat which isn't there, and they found it. Well, you had to think about that for a moment. I caught it right away whenever I heard it. The news media, they're like three blind men. The middle of the night in a dark basement looking for a black cat who wasn't there, and lo and behold, they found him. They can find things that don't exist out there, in other words. But they're pretty good at finding things that do exist. Oh, we're not justifying the news media. That little example is a good critique of the news media. But the news media, because of Vietnam, because of Watergate, they don't believe what the political leaders tell them anymore. I don't either. I'm not worried about it, whether they're telling me the truth or not. But it's one thing to be caught up in this charismatic mania of let's support the government and go to all these breakfasts for congressmen and send them anointed prayer claws because they're really God's men for the hour. It's another thing to be caught up in that and to recognize all of the subterfuge, all of the deception that goes on in this Christian U.S. of A. There are things going on right now that none of us know anything about. That if we knew, it'd be unbelievable what the CIA is up to, who they're trying to assassinate next, who they're trying to murder next. That's right. You get in the way. We're supposed to have courts that protect people, but you get in the way of some of the great leaders of power today, and that's why people die mysteriously in jail or over here or over there. That's why they die mysteriously. It's because the CIA gets to them. That's right. Or the FBI or just a good old rural country sheriff. They're sometimes worse than the CIA because of the bastion of power that the typical Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee sheriff has. I think in the last year, 12 sheriffs in 12 counties in those 4 states have been arrested on high charges like peddling cocaine because they're out in a rural area and they'll find someone, especially you get over in eastern Tennessee with the Smoky Mountains. The forests are so dense there, that's become one of the major places, besides California and her dense forest, for the importation of drugs into this country now. And so those sheriffs get over there and really act tough and raid those stations and pick up all that cocaine and marijuana and then sell it out of the back end of the station wagon of the police cars that go around town. And yet, if you tell anybody, oh, you're in for it, that local sheriff. I mean, he controls with an iron fist that region around him. We're talking about Nashville, Knoxville, Memphis being miles and miles away. He's out in the middle of only a place where the vultures would dare to descend. And that's where these sheriffs are. We're talking about ethics of power. Right here in this country, everything's controlled by this lust and by this greed for power. So Machiavelli said that a good political leader is one like a human fox. He backtracks on everyone. He tries to deceive everyone. He's one who keeps the faith whenever it's in his favor. Whenever new situations arise, then it's time to break them. Machiavelli also said that the art of war should be the primary study and the primary concern of every prince. Remember, his book is entitled The Prince, written in 1513. And what that is about how to be a successful, lying, adulterous, conniving leader, political leader, as a human fox, as one who makes his primary concern the study of the art of war. How to make sure you defeat your enemies before your enemies defeat you. He said that right is whatever strengthens the state. Right is whatever strengthens the state. I was reading here, I've been reading these past few weeks, Wesley's 14 volumes on his life and theology. And I found an interesting quote I thought I'd share with you from John Wesley's journal, dated January the 26th, 1737, where Wesley had the following to say. After he'd been traveling in a certain area, he was headed home, and whenever he had extra time, and he didn't have a lot of extra time, he was always making sure that he was up to date on the great works in theology and the great works in politics in years gone by. He says, in my passage home, having procured a celebrated book entitled The Works of Niccolo Machiavelli, I set myself carefully to read and to consider it. I began with a prejudice in his favor, having been informed that he had often been misunderstood and greatly misrepresented. So Wesley felt, well, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, because I've heard that people have taken Machiavelli out of context. I weighed the sentiments that were less common, transcribed the passages wherein they were contained, compared one passage with another, and endeavored to form a cool, impartial judgment. And my cool judgment is that if all the other doctrines of demons which have been committed to writing since letters were in the world collected together in one volume, it would fall short of this. And that should a prince form himself by this book, so calmly recommending hypocrisy, treachery, lying, robbery, oppression, adultery, whoredom, and murder of all kinds, that Domitian or the Emperor Nero would be as an angel of God compared to this man. That's what he thought about Machiavelli. That's what our thoughts about Machiavelli are. That's what our thoughts are about the way that governments are run today. Now you see, our purpose in beginning here with Machiavelli is to show that because of the influence of his book, The Prince, and we'll say some more things whenever we get to some things later on about people who followed in the footsteps in Italy of Machiavelli, but people who've come after Machiavelli, the nations of the world, who have come after the printing and publishing of Machiavelli's book, The Prince, in 1513, based their political and national existence, for the most part, upon his works, especially the so-called civilized nations of the world today. That's what they're controlled by. And Wesley compares him to being something 100 times worse than a Domitian or than a Nero. Okay, let's go on to another individual. Machiavelli. Very, very important. Famous name in Italian history. Let's come to a famous name in English history, Thomas Hobbes, Hobbes, who was a personal friend of Francis Bacon, a personal friend of Descartes, a familiar acquaintance with Galileo, who, in fact, if I remember correctly, based his theories of political absolutism upon the laws of motion that were put down in writing by the scientist Galileo. Galileo had, although it was a simple law, had reversed the understanding of the laws of motion that had been held up until his time Because up until his time, it was felt by most people in the world, it was felt by most people in science, that the natural state of any body, B-O-D-Y, not a person, but of any object, of any physical body, that the natural state of any body is the state of rest. And Galileo revolutionized the whole world by saying that the natural state of every body, of every object, is that of motion. That everything remains in motion unless and until it's acted upon by some outside force, which just was the foundation for the study of atoms with Einstein and a lot of things that came later. That nothing is still, everything is moving. That's its natural state, is to be moving, to be transit, to be going somewhere. And so Hobbes, who lived 1588 to 1679, picked this very teaching up and applied it into the political realm. That the natural state for the political prince or leader is the state of motion. It's the state of the lust and the greed for power. It was in 1651 that he wrote his masterpiece. You have to keep the right books with the right name. I've studied these. I've studied some of them in college and some of them since then and found them to be very, very interesting. But his masterpiece, this book right here, tremendous, tremendous book written in 1651 entitled Leviathan, which was his name, Leviathan. He took it right from the Bible. He was a great student of the Bible. As a matter of fact, a good, half? Yeah. Over half. More than half of his book is a systematic theology. It's what it amounts to. He gives you a whole description of the existence of God, and I think the last chapter in here, as a matter of fact, is entitled Of the Kingdom of Darkness. He was very concerned about principalities and powers and evil spirits and Satan, and he went back and, it's just remarkable what he has here. He didn't believe, by the way, in Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, and we're talking about 1651. Wow. We're talking about long before the times of Doderlin and Astruc and these others who came on the scene later. 1651. He had read Deuteronomy 34. And he concluded from that, well, Moses couldn't have written that because he died in that passage. So maybe he didn't write any of the rest of the Pentateuch as well. He went back there to Genesis chapter 12. This is some of his arguments that I remember from reading Leviathan, where the statement is made that the Canaanite was then in the land, as though when the book is being written, the Canaanite was not then in the land. And since it was in the land, those Canaanites were in the land when Moses allegedly lived, then he couldn't have written the book of Genesis. And a lot of the other so-called proofs talking about there being a king in the land and all of these things that have been dreamed up by the critics since then, but interestingly enough that we find in embryonic form in Thomas Hobbes. As I said, he's an Englishman who frequently quoted the Bible. His book is just filled with quotations for the Bible to support his position of submission to authority. He really loved Romans 13. But you see, he misapplied the passage because he made the political leaders out to be wolves, to be human foxes like Machiavelli did in his book, The Prince. Perhaps the most important thing that we can say for right now about Thomas Hobbes is that it's to Hobbes we owe the invention of the most important and the longest lasting dictum for the power of ethics. You've probably heard this before, that might makes right. Remember, a dictum is always a little short sentence or phrase in summing up the whole position of a leader or of a doctrine. Might makes right. More power to the powerful. It's might that makes right, not that right makes might. Whoever is strong, it's might that makes right. Whoever is strong, we said before of Machiavelli that he said that right is whatever strengthens the state. Right is whatever brings might. So, obviously, might would make right. Now, he agreed with Machiavelli that the basic doctrine of all men should be the doctrine of political absolutism. That the problems of the world were problems of politics, and that the problems of politics were problems of power. But he denied that the basis of political absolutism should be the age-old English doctrine of the divine right of kings, but rather he substituted simple human psychology, that some were made to wield power and others were made to render service. It would help if you knew a background of the Tudor kings and the Bourbon kings and the French Revolution and a lot of European history to understand the time context when the works of Machiavelli and Hobbes, like The Prince and Leviathan, and they wrote other books, especially Hobbes, went on to write Behemoth. Naturally, you'd have to finish Leviathan with Behemoth later on in life to serve as a complement to it. But these are set in the time context of tremendous things that are going on in the revolutionary explosions in Europe. But it had been an age-old doctrine of the English people that had been propagated naturally by the aristocracy in England, that the basis for political absolutism should be the doctrine of the divine right of kings. What do we mean by that? The divine right of kings, that a king has power because God gave him his power, which is exactly what the Bible teaches. That's the basis for a political empire, is you have power because God gave you power. It's known as the doctrine of the divine right of kings in England. It's not held to by anybody anymore today. No, everybody's adopted the might makes right philosophy of Hobbes, the human psychological basis for political absolutism, that the reason some people get to power and the reason others don't is because of their psychological makeup. Some people just have the greed to control. And you think about this, it seems to make a lot of sense. You don't find just a non-thinking pauper out there in the world who grows to a great political prestige and position, or do you, we might add in parentheses. But what you find is one who has a lust and a greed for power. The only way you go up is to have this desire and to have the ability to wield power once you have it. And so it was a tremendous substitution of the prevalent English doctrine prior to that, the divine right of kings, when he said that some are made to control others. Some are just made because of the way they think, because of their psychological makeup. They are prime candidates for being in political absolute control, whereas others, due to their psychological makeup, simply can never hope to get to a position like that. They're made to render service. And yet you still can't. You see, he's substituting the biblical doctrine of the divine right of kings, that a king has power because he has the divine right to have the power. However wicked he is, he has the divine right. Not a political right, not a psychological right, not a power right, a divine right to have power because he's been given power by the one who controls all power. Romans 13 and verse 1. And so it completely changed the way the English people thought about political systems and power, and as a result completely changed the way a lot of the world thought, because at this time Great Britain had a far-flung colonial empire that spread around the globe. She controlled so much of Africa, so much of Asia, that it was just unreal. And so whatever she believed would be propagated through the merchants, through the traders, through the captains of the ships to different parts of her empire throughout the world. You have to trace these things in a history like that, and you'll just see how one thing goes to another, one thing leads to another, and one thing spreads to another. Now, all that we've said thus far, we'll sum it up here before we have other things to say. All of this that we've studied thus far has come before the rise of the great totalitarian states and nations of the world. Because even in Italy and even in England, we have changes among the middle class, the lower class, the popular people in the centuries after the times of Machiavelli and Hobbes. In other words, England at that time, just because of Hobbes' doctrine of human psychology as being the basis for the divine right of kings set forth in Leviathan, just because Thomas Hobbes had that doctrine, just because Niccolo Machiavelli had his doctrine of absolutism, didn't make, I hate to call it a country, because Italy wasn't a country. England was a country at that time. Italy didn't become a country until just last century. But let's just say the states of Italy that make up what we know as Italy today, that they did not become a sovereign power. Italy didn't become a sovereign power that was controlled by an absolute lord. Neither did England at this time. It wasn't until centuries later that we have the rise of what we call today the totalitarian states, or the totalitarian nations of the world. That, as you'll see when we get into the next two names, have only come about recently and have really, we could say, congealed or fermented the doctrines of Machiavelli and the doctrines of Thomas Hobbes. Totalitarian means total control by the government. Total control by the government. Look what goes on, for instance, in Poland today. That is total control by the communist government there. Solidarity tried to gather together by means of labor union. The people, what happened? The government just smashed that. And yet, does the government do that in our country today? Well, certainly not. We're the great problem of the world because we have a capitalistic society here. And that's what gives you all your problems because of all the people that are involved. And the government kind of is supposed to, anyway, relax some of the restraints and let the people own some of their own means of production and be their own employers rather than just employees who more or less, and generally it's more, work for the state. But Poland's a good example today of a totalitarian state that the government is in absolute control. Now, Italy, the states of Italy, remember Italy's not a nation under Machiavelli, but the states of Italy were not totalitarian in nature, either when Machiavelli wrote his book The Prince in 1513 or shortly thereafter. That didn't come about until some time later. And by the way, just because you go that route to totalitarianism doesn't mean that a reversal won't soon come. Italy today is not a totalitarian nation. It was at one time, not too long ago. But Italy is not that way today. England is not that way today. England has never been a totalitarian government as the communist bloc nations of the world that we see today. So that ought to sum up from Thrasymachus through Machiavelli through Thomas Hobbes.